Villages, 1370 AM, 96.3 FM, The Source.
All right. 7 minutes after 11 o'clock. Gosh, it's a nice looking Wednesday out there, isn't it?
It is gorgeous.
Beautiful. All right. Every once in a while, there's a book that comes our way that is more than just a book. It is a way of learning about ourselves while at the same time learning about one individual. I guess you could say that about a lot of biographies. This one is clearly one of those. David Greene is on the phone. He wrote this really touching book. It's called He Could Make Words Sing. An ordinary man during extraordinary times, and I apologize in advance if I'm going to say his dad's name incorrectly. Harry Greene, I'm just going to say it that way, and he'll correct me if I'm wrong. One of the most compelling portraits of the world of New York's immigrant Jews in a time of nativism, depression, and war. David has a list of credentials that are very impressive. He's an adjunct and field supervisor for Fordham University. He's a mentor for Teach for America Corps members in the Bronx. We went to the Bronx just last Tuesday, right?
Yes, we did. Yes, we did. Wonderful stuff.
A staff member of WISE Services. He's the treasurer of Save Our Schools. He taught social studies and coached football at A.E. Stevenson High School in the Bronx, Woodlands High School in Greensburg, New York, and Scarsdale High School in Scarsdale, New York. And he's the son-in-law, by the way, of Harry Greene. Did I say father? I meant father-in-law. Good morning, David. How are you?
Good morning, and you're not the first person to mispronounce his name. It's Greisman.
See, I had two choices, and I went for the wrong one. It's like when you're plugging in something in the wall, you know there's one way that's wrong and one way that's right, and you always get it wrong the first time.
It's always that EI combination.
Where are you right now?
I'm in Westchester. That's where I live right now. So I'm at home in Westchester. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we were just there last week. We went to the Bronx to bring a plate to a church, by the way. It's just kind of a long story. I won't bore you with it. Your story is very touching.
Thank you.
You start off with this beautiful story, but heartbreaking story. Although I wouldn't want your mother to hear me say it was heartbreaking, or your wife's
mother-in-law.
Your wife's mother. Yeah. Yeah, so I don't want to tell the story. You tell the story. What am I referring to there?
Well, the book actually opens up with a story my brother-in-law tells, because he saw a parallel between his life and his dad's life. His dad was stationed in Camp Butner in North Carolina, not far from Raleigh, being trained prior to World War II. And while he was there, he went to a USO dance and met this beautiful woman who actually met two Harrys and chose him. And this is where the title comes from, chose him because, as she said in letters that she wrote, which you see are scattered throughout the book, as well as his, that he could make words sing, and that's why she chose him. It's also the epitaph on his gravestone.
Is that right?
Yes.
Oh wow.
Yeah, and so they struck up a very strong relationship. He was allowed. And this is a New York, Brooklyn Jew, all right, who's down in the Deep South in the early 40s, where, sometimes it wasn't that, it's a dangerous place to be, let alone strike up a romantic relationship with the Southern Belle. And so they kept correspondence going on through the war, and he, I think, felt very strongly about, after the war, proposing to her, moving down to Raleigh. He wanted, and being a newspaper man down there and staying down there, he loved that bucolic life that he had experienced when he was able to get off the base. And he got a Dear Harry letter at the end of the war from her, basically saying that she thought the religious differences and cultural differences, the baggage would be too great to carry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so she told him she had met somebody else and she was marrying. And then he met my mother-in-law, Iris, from Brooklyn, and married her. Mm-hmm. And interestingly enough, they kept corresponding all the way through until he died in 1997.
And did the spouses know?
Oh, yes.
They did?
Absolutely.
Oh, wow.
Right. So the story, to get back to that, is that my brother-in-law went off to school at Colgate and stayed up there to teach in another sort of semi-rural, well, that's a pretty rural place in Colgate, Hamilton, New York, upstate New York. And while he was there, met a young woman from Lexington, Kentucky, fell in love, and got married, much to the chagrin of his mom, but to the absolute delight of his dad. And so the story sort of that his father was able to appreciate and love Richard's wife because he sees that his son was able to do something that he was not able to do 40 years earlier.
I gotcha. Okay, and that's why I was confused who was the father and who was the father-in-law.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh my gosh. So did you know him?
Yes, I knew him, but nobody really knew him. I knew him as a very quiet, it's true. He's of that generation of men who were of the silent generation, and he didn't really speak all that much. He kept most of his emotions to himself. He didn't talk at all about the war, even though we saw, I was able to discover a treasure trove of material that he had buried around in the basement. And he was just, the quiet guy who would go to work, come home, suck on his pipe, have his doers, eat dinner, tell terrible puns, and it was sort of in the background. And it was interesting because I was just at Thanksgiving with most of his remaining family, and some of them had read the book already, and they said, "Yeah, that's Harry. We didn't really know him. He was always just sort of in the background when everybody else was, bubbly and filled with discussion. He was always just there." But it turns out his life was far more than that.
And do you know that it's far more than that because of the words he wrote?
Because of the words he wrote and the documents that he left behind, which included his entire veterans record, including the notes that he took while he was at training to be a forward observer in the Army in the 78th Division. Wow. And so we had all this material and things that he had written. He was the editor and a writer for a newspaper called the Forward Observer, which was his unit's newspaper. He went on to be a translator and an interpreter because he was fluent in German at the end of the war at Berlin, and brought home these Nazi documents, which subsequently I hand-delivered to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., which they said they had not had before.
Wow.
So I found out all this stuff about him, and also through the letters that he and Anne had written back and forth, which, by the way, were in a chapter of a book called Love Letters of World War II.
Did you have a better understanding of the World War II era from his writing?
Well, because I sort of am a historian and I taught it, I knew the facts of it.
I think that's why I wanted to know, because somebody who's already studied it might have a different perspective. Like if you were Anne Frank's uncle or something, and you know what I mean? It would be, you could have been a historian, but that little slice of history might not have made it to you.
Well, that's why the book is sort of half history and half biography, because most people don't know, and unfortunately, especially today, and the history they were taught was mostly facts, names, dates, et cetera, and I've told, very often, "Oh, I hated history," and I said, "Thank you very much, you were never in my class." So one of the things I wanted to do is I wanted to put his story in context and so that people could see that the events in the world shape your life, and how you react to them and how millions of people react to them shape those events in return. And so they could feel history through him, not just factually read about it. And also because I think it draws so many parallels to many of the things we're going through today.
Right, and I picked up on that too.
Was Harry an immigrant, or was he born here?
No, he was born here. His parents were immigrants, so he was to use a 21st century word, he's a dreamer. So he was born here of immigrants who passed through Ellis Island, that had all of their old school Eastern European cultural baggage, religious baggage. He was a Jew in an era where they were passing anti-quota laws against Eastern European Jews in the 1920s. Mm-hmm. Just as we now have, the Muslim bans, et cetera, et cetera. There are so many things. And one of the things that he and his friends from Brooklyn all did was assimilate into American life. They dropped everything that would identify them, except their name, as sons and daughters of Eastern European immigrants. You would never hear it in his voice, in the way he wrote, in anything. Even in the cover photo, he looks, like the WASP other friends that he worked with at an ad agency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure does.
Like George Gershwin.
A little bit, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And by the way, I have the cover of the book on the podcast that we're doing right now. So if you're listening on the internet, you'll see the cover.
Cool.
I found it on Amazon. Real quickly, let me tell people how to get the book. It is on Amazon, but do you have a website dedicated to the book?
Well, there's a Facebook page,
okay,
and a web page. The Facebook page is basically he could make words sing, and you could find it there. But also, there's a page entitled the same thing on WordPress.
So you must be very close to your wife's side of the family.
Yes.
Okay, and how did they? Well, I guess you've already told me this. That they are responding well to the book.
They're responding well to the book. One of the things they said is that it's touched off, especially the older members of the family. Obviously, it's touched off memories that they had that had been buried for such a long time. So it's been interesting. Yeah.
Just a kind of a curious question because we're in Florida. Where did they move to in Florida?
Fort Lauderdale, where almost all New York Jews moved.
You had said that he wanted originally to be a sports writer and be a novelist, but that didn't happen for him.
Well, yeah, and that's, again, another very common story, that I think so many of us Americans can share. He had these dreams. He wanted to be a writer. He wanted to be a sports writer first. Then, when he met Ann down in North Carolina, he wanted to be a newspaper man in general, and wherever that would lead. But when he came home and he married and he had a family, he had to get a job. And where else could a writer get a job in New York but in the advertising industry? So he dropped all his dreams. He never wrote what he wanted to write. I think part of the reason he stored all that stuff was that he maybe hoped the eventuality might occur that he would, but he never did, even after he retired.
So you're obviously a writer. He's an in-law relative. Do any of his blood relatives write?
Interestingly enough, nobody's published anything, but his son Richard, I think, as you could tell from that opening in the book, is quite an excellent writer too.
Yes.
Are you Jewish also?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So there was no resistance when you proposed to his daughter then?
Oh, no. Actually, her mom set us up.
Oh, okay.
we worked at the same place, and she was sort of in charge of personnel, and I guess was screening everybody who was hired, and said, "You should try this guy."
So, my family also my father's side has roots in Brooklyn, and his brother fell in love with a woman in South Carolina, and
okay.
Although not Jewish, I think he faced that same Yankee resistance kind of stuff,
Oh yeah, I mean, every time I go down south, and I talk to people down there, they still talk about we were down in Charleston, and we were staying with some people down there, and we were having this conversation. And we were saying, the war of northern aggression. So even today, that does occur.
Well, you know what? Do a talk show in the South, and you'll find this.
We're not going to go anywhere near that subject.
How did his fellow servicemen accept him while they were in World War II together?
Well, we actually had to convince him to get back in touch with people. His artillery unit had actually established a newsletter and a way for them to connect and meet and maybe travel back to Europe. And for years he declined, and finally we convinced him to do it. And and I think that was good for him, but he never really expressed to what extent he appreciated that.
One of the things that we face in radio, it struck me as I looked through the book, is this. I'll give you an example. We had one time an advertiser who was selling a bath oil that he claimed would cure Alzheimer's if you took a bath in this oil. And
snake oil, actually.
I said to Robin, I said to Robin, I said, I can't do this one. This is not good. So we didn't do it. But anyway, there have been some that we did, and then later on we realized after it was too late, oh my gosh, that wasn't real, or whatever. There was something real. Now, and that's not exactly what is in the book. What is it? Phthalate? What is the substance that was in the shampoo that was causing birth defects?
Oh, I can't recall the name of the substance. Hang on a second. Oh God, it slips my mind. But it was a huge. It was a huge thalidomide.
Well, so let me tell the listeners, there was some kind of an ingredient in shampoo, and the only reason it was causing birth defects, and
right.
The only reason I bring it up is because it sounds like he felt bad that he was a party to selling it to people, because he was writing copy that made people say, "Oh, I can, I'll take a."
Yeah. And it's funny because he and his son had a huge argument. It's thalidomide.
Yes. Thank you.
Right, and he and his son had this huge argument about it because his son Richard said, "This is in the '60s." And said, "How could you do that? How could you be part of an organization that advertised this stuff, even after knowing?" And one of the things Harry was loyal, and his loyalty to his company, and the fact that I think he was so concerned with security that if he felt that if he spoke up, he might lose his job, and that would be a disaster.
Wow.
Did he have a favorite decade that he would keep going back toward to tell stories?
Well, that's a great question. I think if he could, it would be the time that he was in the South. Before he was shipped off to Europe, and I think there would be three. There would be that one. There would be his time at Baruch College in New York City, where he was. I found his yearbook, and there are all these references to him. It's like, oh, he must have been like, whoa, who's Harry?
Yeah, exactly.
and then I think, in the days when, as an ad man, he was a creative person and was feeling a lot of success in coming up with some of these campaigns, which, by the way, some of the products were also used in the series Mad Men.
Oh my, that's great.
So, but he never saw it because he passed away before the series was on.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in those days when his kids were young, and his early creative success at work would be one, and then his time down in the South with Anne, and then being this young Brooklynite in college in the 30s, except for the Depression, of course.
Well, I mentioned in the beginning that it's one person's story, but it's also all of our stories, and I think everybody can relate to this. I can on the New York level, but I think everybody can in some level. The book is called "He Could Make Words," saying it's a story about an ordinary man during extraordinary times. David Greene is the author. This is a book about his father-in-law, Harry Greisman.
Yeah, you got it.
Got it right that time?
That time, yeah.
And you sent me a copy of the book, so let me give this away to one of our listeners. If you would like the book that David sent me, you can call right now, and I'll leave it for you here. The rest of us...
And it comes fully illustrated.
It's got wonderful photographs in it. Wonderful and somewhat disturbing in some cases, this photograph. But I wanted to give it away and tell everybody I found it on Amazon, and you said there was a Facebook page, right? That's it?
There's a Facebook page for it, and there's a blog on WordPress. It's also called He Can Make Words Sing.
And your book is very, very insightful, because even though, Harry was a smooth sailing kind of guy, he had his ups and downs, and he really was able to get through everything and provide a great life and a fun life for himself and his family.
And again, that's another way that people can see themselves within him, regardless of where they're from, because it also deals very much with daily, everyday life and struggles and family, and how events impact them.
So let me ask you this. This is a question to you as the teacher you are. Is it easier to teach students after you've taught them for several years? In other words, do you learn tricks, not that the information you're teaching them is changing, but how to get them to hear it? And I'm wondering if this type of book actually makes teaching history better or easier for you.
Well, it's interesting because I shaped the book based upon the way I taught, because I always felt very strongly that the more you can personalize history and take students and put them in history, the easier it is to understand it, because you can intellectualize all you want, but until you get to understand what it's like to be in people's shoes,
right.
You can memorize, but you don't understand.
Right.
The key to me is always understanding.
Yes.
And the best way to do that is to create simulations, which is what I did a lot of, where they actually got to be in the situations that historical characters were in, or not even famous characters. So, if we were talking about the French Revolution, it's great. Yeah, you could play Louis, and you could play Robespierre, but how about Jean-Pierre Lafitte or somebody else, the guy who's trying to get bread from that bakery. You need to know how everybody lives during a time period, because it's more than just the people you read about in textbooks. History is about everyone who lived during those times.
Sure is.
And that's why I think this book is important.
Well, you would have made history much more interesting for me, I think.
Yeah.
David Greene, thank you for being on the air with us today. Good luck with the book, and come back with whatever you have next time. Thank you.
Thanks very much for having me on. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. We will be right back.
Matt Lauer fired by NBC after allegations of sexual misconduct. Colleagues like Megyn Kelly speaking out.
This one does hit close to home. I too have known Matt for a long time, and he has been a friend and kind and supportive to me in my transition to NBC News.
Kelly saying while she does see the anguish on her coworkers' faces,
we don't see the career opportunities women lose because of sexual harassment, or the intense stress it causes a woman dealing with it when she comes to work each day. I am thinking of those women this morning.
The New York Post reporting Lauer allegedly sexually assaulted an NBC staffer during the Sochi Winter Olympics in 2014.